In this next tutorial, we will learn to model a table, a lamp, and a fruit. And through this exercise, we will be able to go through different modeling techniques, and we will also keep adding on to learning about the interface and more hotkeys and shortcuts to make working in Maya easier. So let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. And to begin with, we already went through this, but let's do it again. We're gonna create a new project folder. So let's go to File, Project Window. If you haven't already, let's create our table, lamp, and fruit project file. So if you haven't typed it in, just click on New, type in the name of your folder, select the location where you want this folder to be. In my case, I will use my desktop. And then hit accept. So now whenever we save our scene, it'll automatically save it into the scenes folder inside of the larger project folder, table, lamp, and fruit. Okay, so to get started, let's go ahead and create our table. First of all, we want something flat and square. So let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and let's start out with a cube. So if we look to the right, we have our Attribute Editor tab on. If you don't have it, you can just click onto the side, or another shortcut would be Control A. Control A will kind of switch you through the Attribute Editor and the channel box. Now that we have this open, let's go to the channel box. And the channel box lets us control more detailed information about the size or units in our geometry. We can give it specific commands such as scaling in X, Y, and Z, rotating or translating, but with specific units. So let's go ahead and scale our tabletop. So we want to shorten it in the Y axis. So let's go to Scale Y, and maybe if all of our units are 1:1, we want this to be 0.2. So this has made it flatter. We want to actually now grow it to the sides. So let's go ahead and scale it on Y2, and then type 2 in Z as well. Okay, so these are better proportions for our tabletop. Now we need the legs. So let's go ahead and make another cube. And let's change the units in this one. So maybe we need to scale it also that it's 0.2, the same way the tabletop was. But this time we need to scale it in Z and X. Right, so if we go to Z and we scale it to 0.2, and then we go to X, and we also scale it at 0.2, we can orbit around our scene and look at the proportions, see if we like them or see if there's something that needs to be different. I think my legs need to be a little bit longer, which means I need to scale them up in Y direction. So let's go ahead and do Y. Scale it twice, so number 2, and I think this might work a little bit better. So let's remember what we learned about snapping objects onto corners. So we want to bring the leg to the edges of our table. If we hit W, we got the move tool on, and if we hit D and hold it and hit V, we are able to snap it. So we want to be able to snap it to this corner. And now that we've snapped the pivot point, it's going to be really easy to move the table leg onto the first corner of the tabletop. So let's hit V and then drag it until it snaps to the edge. Okay, and so since this is a pretty simple geometry and everything is quite symmetrical, we can go ahead and use duplicate. So hit Shift D, and now we'll see that we have 2 legs on our outliner. So for the second leg, we need to switch the pivot point again. So let's go ahead and hit D and V and snap our pivot point to the outer edge. Once it's snapped, we hit V and we drag it to the other edge of the table. So it's pretty simple, and now that we have 2 legs, we can also duplicate them at the same time. So Shift D, and then we can move our legs to the side. We want to switch again our pivot point so that it's in the other edge of the legs. So let's hit D and V and snap it to the other side. So with both items selected, let's hit V and snap the legs. So we have now the basics of our tabletop. We want to bring it up so that it's on the leveled with the ground plane. So let's go ahead and select everything, and maybe we can switch to the 4 viewports. So let's hit our spacebar. And now that we have our 4 viewports, it'll be much easier to move the table up and know where it's at in the level ground. So now that it's up, we can go back to perspective mode and hit spacebar. And now go ahead and hit F to zoom selected. Here is our tabletop. So now that we have our tabletop, let's go ahead and add detail to it. So if I go and select my top, and then I right click and hold my mouse, a new menu appears. And this menu, this top part, allows you to actually edit components of your geometry. So once we have the cube, we can actually go into it and select certain vertices, for example, and edit the geometry from the vertices. I'm going to go and hit Control Z to undo this. I just wanted you to see the ways in which you can edit components from the geometry. If I right click again and I go to face, you'll see that I can select each face of my tabletop. But now what I want to do actually is miter the edges of the top so that they're rounded. So in order to do that, what we would actually need to select is edge. So if you right click, drag your mouse towards edge and then let go, it automatically selects that function. Now let's select all of the top edges. And once we have them selected, we want to make sure we're in modeling mode. So if you're in another menu, just go here on the drop down and select modeling, and that will open up all of the mesh editing tools and commands. So let's go ahead and select edit mesh and bevel. So now we'll see that this little bar shows up, and it's actually by default beveled the edges of my tabletop, but we can control the fraction of how much of the edge we want to bevel, and we also can control how many segments. So if we want to round the tabletop, for example, we can change the depth. So if we want to miter it towards the outside or the inside. So go ahead and try these different sliders and then just choose how you want to have the edge of your tabletop to be. And once you're done, you can just go back and right click your mouse and select object mode. This will take you out of the edge editing mode and bring you back to the object mode, so you can select your whole tabletop and not parts of it. So I've rounded the edges of my table. I've snapped the legs to each corner. What I'm missing now is to be able to have this all be one single geometry, because now that my model is done and I'm happy with the way it looks, I want it to be one single element so that I can move the table and it will move together with the legs, for example. So in order to do that, we can select the whole elements in the scene. And then let's go to Mesh Tools. So if we go to Mesh, Booleans, and Union. This is a simple Maya operation that will unite any mesh that is touching with another mesh. It will unite them into one. So now if I click out and in, you'll see that it reads my table as a whole. Now let's go ahead and rename our object so that we can easily find it in our outliner. So I've renamed it to table, and the more elements I have, it's a good practice to get used to renaming your geometries so that you always know what you're selecting and you make it much easier. I would like to move the pivot point to one of the corners of the legs, because I think eventually it'll make it easier for me to guide my object having it there rather than floating in the middle. What happened now is that when I did the Boolean operation, Maya automatically moved the pivot point to the center of the geometry. So that's why it's there. But let's go ahead and hit D and V and move our pivot point to the corner of a leg. I think this will make it easier for me to decide where in the ground I want my table to be in the future. If you look to the right, we had our channel box editor open, but we can also switch to the attribute editor. And if you look at these tabs, you can see the kind of steps we've gone through to model the table. So for example, this was the Boolean operation that we did to unite the legs with the top. This is the bevel operation we did to modify our mesh, our tabletop, right? To modify the edges and curve them. This is your original components. So Polycube 1 was the first element we modeled, which is the tabletop. I moved these around so you can see that you can always go to the attribute editor and actually change settings around and modify your mesh. So I'm going to hit Control Z to go back to where we were. Polycube 2 we'll see is one of the legs. I'm going to hit Control Z and so on. So we can also see the different materials in our object. Right now, Maya has the default material on for every object we model. We'll learn to add materials onto our scene in the coming tutorials. But you can see for now here that you can easily change, for example, the color of a material, and it'll update in your viewport. So let's pick a color for our table. If we look to the left, and you look at all of these titles here, P-Cube 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, this is the history of all of our modeling process in order to make the table. Whenever we finished and we're happy with the result of a object and the way it's 3D modeled, we can get rid of all of the history, and this will keep our scene clean and make the file size smaller. So in order to delete the history of the table that we have already finished, let's go ahead and hit Edit, And then in delete, we'll go delete all by type. What this will do is it will take all of the elements in the scene into account in order to do this operation. And what do I want to delete? I want to delete the history. So now if we look to the left, we cannot see all of the transformations in the history of our table. If we hit table and look to the right now in our attribute editor, you'll see that since we've deleted the history of the tabletop of the process of 3D modeling it, we've lost several tabs now because we've lost all of the memory it took to create the Boolean operation, and we've also lost the bevel command, right? And we've also lost the different components in the table. It's reading it as a whole right now. So make sure to delete the history only if you're happy with the result of your object. If you want to keep experimenting with its shape, I recommend you don't delete the history. So if we look at our attribute editor, we have all of these weird numbers here that are defining the location here in Translate. This is where the table is located, right? So if I move it around, you'll see these numbers moving. But now that I already like what I've modeled and I want to have just clear numbers here, and I don't want to kind of start from these weird off numbers, I can decide to reset certain transformations. So this is going to kind of center everything to 0. If I go to modify, make sure you're selecting your table, modify, and reset transformations, you'll see that it's automatically centered everything to 0. And it's also moved my pivot point to 0. If we hit Control Z and undo this, we're going to look at another option. Let's say that this is where I want my tabletop to stay, and I want to keep the pivot point here. And I want my scene to understand this as just the 0 location for my table. I can go to Modify and hit Freeze Transformations. So what this does is it tells Maya that this is the 0 location, and this is the 0 rotation, and the scale is at 1. So it'll bring everything back to 0. So again, just as a reminder, modify, reset transformations will center everything to 0, and modify freeze transformations will lock things in place. Okay, so this is the first part of our tutorial. Let's go ahead and save this scene because we have our first element ready. So let's go ahead and go to File, Save Scene As, and you'll see that Maya has already located your scene inside the project folder that you set. If for some reason you're not in your project folder, always make sure to check up here where it's located. If it's not in your project folder, a really easy way to go to that location is going here, Set Project, finding again your project folder, double-clicking, hit Set, and now it should be in the right place. So it's going to save it in the Scenes folder inside of your project folder here. So I'm going to save it as Table version 1. And continue. And that's the first part.